አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን እምቢኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us from around the world. This is Adebabay Media's Ze'er Digest program. My name is Hiwet and I'll be your host. Today we have invited an author, journalist, and professor, Dr. Tedros Kiros, to talk to us about philosophical traditions of Ethiopia, specifically about the 17th century philosopher Ze'er Yacob. I would like to ask everyone to share and like this conversation and to stay with us.
Adebabay Media የኔ ነው። Adebabay Media የኔም ነው።
Adebabay Media የኔ ነው።
Adebabay Media የሁላችንም ነው።
የኛ ቤተሰብ Adebabay Mediaን ይመለከታል። የእናንተስ?
Do your parents watch Adebabay Media?
Watch, follow, subscribe and help Adebabay. Adebabay Media ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ።
I am honored and privileged today to introduce my guest, Dr. Tedros Kiros. Dr. Tedros Kiros is a philosopher, journalist, professor, novelist, and who's considered a leading authority on moral philosophy and a leading voice in African philosophy as well. He has been a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University for the last 20 years. Dr. Kiros is also an executive producer and hoster of the television program African Ascent. He is also an author and editor of 13 books, including Self-Construction and the Formation of the Human Value, Truth, Language, and Desire, Exploration and African Political Thoughts, Multiculturalism, Ethiopian Discourse, and the book we are here to discuss today, Ze'er Yacob, Rationality of the Human Heart, among many books. He is currently a professor at Berklee College in the music department. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to come here today, and welcome to Adebabay Media, Dr. Tedros.
Well, thank you so much. What a great honor for me at this stage of my life to share what I think I know, what I've been patiently working on for the past 40 years, both as a professional philosopher in moral philosophy, as he mentioned, and also a novelist. Two novels thus far. Two are forthcoming. I'm working on them now. One is to be released, and the other one is in the beginning stages. And as you mentioned, I'm also a host and producer of African Ascent, that many consider to be an internationally acclaimed community television program that I have been patiently honing and cultivating for the past 15 years. I yet have to celebrate any one of its anniversaries. I might one day.
Yeah, absolutely. You honestly have done a lot and given a lot for Ethiopia, and specifically in the philosophical tradition, and really for us to be able to understand it. So I want to jump in and start this conversation today. So when we're talking about philosophy, specifically African philosophy, what is the nature of African philosophy?
That's an excellent question. It's a very broad question. Let me slice it analytically in professional terms, sadly. Philosophy, broadly speaking, has four facets to it. What we professional philosophers call epistemology is one part of it, which means the theory of knowledge. There is moral philosophy, reflecting and thinking about the moral and ethical matters. There is logic, which comes with all kinds of complexities. There is also political philosophy, and there is aesthetics, and finally, lately, for example, we have also developed a field called philosophy of religion, which is an analytic attempt at examining what religion means, what it means to be religious, what religious practices are, and so forth and so on. So the modality of philosophy that have been developing for the past 15 years, which has sort of made me reluctantly an authority in moral philosophy, is a blend of moral philosophy and political philosophy. And Ze'er Yacob, this 17th century Ethiopian philosopher, whom we'll be examining with you tonight, and I'm honored to do so. I have attempted to put under the rubrics of several facets of philosophy. He's a philosopher of religion in his own right. He's an ethicist in his own right. He's a moral philosopher in his own right. And finally, he's also a cosmologist and an ontologist. Ontology, the study of the structure of being, for example, a study of the structure of God himself. And cosmology is the study of the composition of the universe, what the universe is made out of, for how long has it been there, so forth and so on. And so the philosopher, Ze'er Yacob, is both a philosopher of religion, but also a moral / ethical philosopher, and an ontologist and cosmologist. So African philosophy then broadly understood deals in broad terms with questions such as what does it mean to be there? What does it mean to exist? When I say there is a table out there, and I should be prepared to distinguish the conditions under which the table is a table, which makes it not a chair, for example, because the conditions under which something is a table is radically different from the conditions under which something is a chair. In this sense, then, something is a chair only because it's not a table, and similarly, something is a table because it's not a chair. This kind of distinctions, these kinds of carefully worked out philosophical inclinations could also be used to characterize the nature of African philosophy. So typically then, an African philosopher of the kind that Ze'er Yacob is, for example, examines what it means to believe in God, examines what is God itself, what does God look like, can we see God, can we feel God, can we hear God, can we smell God, can we taste God, so forth and so on. And then this kind of philosophy invariably leads the philosopher to think about the human senses, through which we see, sense, hear, touch, and taste. And then the philosopher wonders if we can see, if we can use these five senses to examine the sense in which something like God exists. Does God exist? The philosopher asks, because we can see him. Does God exist only because we can touch him? Does God exist only because we can taste him? Does God exist only because we smell him? Or is God beyond these senses? If so, then how do we access God? If God cannot be perceived through one of these five senses, in a way in which we can perceive a table and a chair under the conditions which I specified earlier, can we also subject the idea of believing in God in terms of using these senses, so that we can say, of course, God exists because I can smell him, because I can taste him, because I can touch him, because I could hear him? Or does the believer go beyond these senses and continue to believe in something like the idea of God? And here, of course, if you would allow me to be a bit loquacious, a bit talkative, I would like to do the following. The sense in which Ze'er Yacob is a philosopher of religion, led Ze'er Yacob to think about God, for example. In a similar sense in which his contemporary, the great French philosopher by the name of Descartes did. Both of them wanted to believe in God, but both of them also wanted to prove in some sense, to some degree, under certain kinds of conditions, that God exists. And so Descartes was the contemporary of Ze'er Yacob, although he published his central work called The Meditations, Discourse on Method, for example, in 1637, I think, whereas the Hatata by Ze'er Yacob was written a few years earlier, for example. But both of them cover the same territory. Which territory? An examination of what it means to believe, an examination of believing after proving it yourself. So Descartes does it through what he calls this methodic doubt, in which he says, I want to doubt everything. But there is something that I cannot doubt, he says. I cannot doubt the fact that I'm Descartes, and in that I exist, and in that I must necessarily exist in the shape and form of this person called Descartes, so that I can now begin to examine the fact that I believe in a God, he says. And so he says, I'm going to subject God also, like all these other things in the past, to methodic doubt. I'm going to doubt first that God does not exist. And then I'm going to use all the available scientific techniques with which I'm going to examine and prove to myself that God actually exists, he says. So he says, my examination then has led me to think of God as something which is so perfect that I cannot imagine anything much more perfect than God. A. And B, this God, greater than whom, or more perfect than whom, I just cannot imagine, is also capable of creating himself, he says. This remarkable capacity of perfection gives God an attribute. What kind of attribute? The power and the capacity to make himself into being, to make himself exist. Therefore, God exists, he says. Not at the first major premise. The first major premise is a definition of this God as something great, so great that he cannot imagine any greater than it. And secondly, the greatness includes this remarkable capacity that God has to make himself into being, or to give himself the attribute of existence. Therefore, the conclusion, God exists. So he began with a doubt. He doubted everything. He said, I'm going to believe that God does not exist. But now, after he defined him in this particular manner, he came to the conclusion that if it is the case that he is infinite, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, maximally great, so great that one cannot imagine anything greater than him, and in that this greatness includes the capacity that only God has, namely what? The capacity to make himself exist. Therefore, God exists. Ze'er Yacob proceeds differently. For Ze'er Yacob, he developed what I call, not in this book, but in other articles that I've written, was Descartes used the method of methodic doubt. And Ze'er Yacob, on the other hand, used the method of methodic belief. Methodic belief, by which he means, to begin with, I am not going to doubt that God exists, Ze'er Yacob, he said. In fact, in order for me to prove to myself that God exists, I'm going to believe that he does. And in that, I'm going to pray to him because I believe that he exists, to make it possible for me to prove to myself beyond doubt, beyond any shadow of doubt, that he exists, he says. Additionally, then, he asks a series of questions. He says, I am Ze'er Yacob. I exist. One. But what is the cause of my existence, he says? Well, do I exist because I've always existed? That's rather redundant. He doesn't say anything. Do I exist because something more perfect than me created me? Well, that might be the case, but something more perfect than me, because an imperfect human being is not sufficiently perfect, and in the sense that God is, to be able to create me, to make me exist. So it couldn't be. Well, is it possible that I exist because I created myself? He says, well, that is not only pretentious, but a logical impossibility, because my imperfection implies my incapacity, by definition, not to be able to create myself. So I couldn't possibly have created myself. He said, well, yeah, then I do exist, it appears. I'm here, just like tables and chairs. And I know that I did not create myself. I also know that I couldn't have possibly been created by something more perfect than me. Might it be that my parents created me then? Oh, he says, that is a compelling answer. But then I am led to question further, namely, who created my parents? He said, well, their parents. And who created their parents? Well, I'm going to enter into a vicious circle, an infinite circle from which I couldn't extricate myself, he says. So I am forced purely by the examination of these four possibilities that I entertain to establish that I, Ze'er Yacob, exist, and presuppose that there must be a creator. And I'm going to this creator God. Look at their methods of reflecting.
Yeah.
You see? For Ze'er Yacob, unlike Descartes, he did not think it was even necessary from the very beginning to doubt that God exists. In fact, Ze'er Yacob is thinking, in order for me to even engage in this human exercise of doubting, with doubting or not doubting, believing or not believing, I will have to presuppose the possibility of being given a certain kind of intelligence that is going to make it for me sufficiently possible to dare and examine the nature of God. So that intelligence, that limited intelligence, that imperfect intelligence itself is given to me, not by me. I'm not capable of doing so, but by a creator. And I'm going to call this creator God. African philosophy, then, to answer your question, in this particular sense, has taken this form of thinking about the nature of the transcendent, the nature of the creator, the nature of the cosmos, the nature of the human being, who could believe or not believe, who is perfect but not sufficiently perfect, and then something or the other outside of this human being, a modality of an exceptional intelligence that cannot even be captured through human intelligences, that would make it possible for someone like Ze'er Yacob to dare to examine the nature of God.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love those answers, and you definitely have shown us how deep the idea of philosophy is, and especially when we're talking about African philosophy. So to bring it back to Ethiopia, because we are going to be talking about Ze'er Yacob in depth today, for us to be able to understand how Ze'er Yacob's philosophy is different, we first need to differentiate between the modern philosophy of Ethiopia and the classical philosophy of Ethiopia. So what's the difference between the two, for us to be able to differentiate between the classical and modern, to be able to understand and appreciate Ze'er Yacob the way that we could? That's excellent. This proves to me, unlike many people who throw these terms at me, that you've actually read the book, because there is a chapter entitled Classical Ethiopian Philosophy and Modern Ethiopian Philosophy, with which I set the stage. My first question was rather tedious and long-winded. I'll be very short and curt with respect to answering the second one. Classical Ethiopian philosophy could essentially be captured as an exercise in the usage of unthought out, unreflected, undigested metaphors and proverbs, for example.
Proverbs and metaphors, then, the great Canadian philosopher Claude Sumner, who died a few years ago, who was the one who excavated this master Ethiopian text, the Hatata, from our national library in Addis Ababa, has contended, and quite rightly, that although, first of all, metaphors and proverbs are broadly philosophical. I used analytic devices called philosophy broadly understood and philosophy analytically understood. Proverbs and metaphors, such as the proverbs and metaphors that are inherent in Ethiopian culture, for example, among the Oromos, among the Amhars, among the Guragis, among the Tigrayans, among the Gambelans, among the people of the South, among all the 70 or 75 or more ethnicities that we have. Their discourse, their way of understanding their condition, their existence, their being, their humanity is mediated through proverbs and metaphors. In this sense, metaphors and proverbs themselves are philosophical. But here I'm being prejudiced as a modern philosopher. The task of the modern professional philosopher is not to say that metaphors and proverbs are not sufficiently philosophical. They are. What is Kene? What is Zema? And so on. These are masterfully and brilliantly reflective and philosophical. But they need to be articulated. They need to be worked out, because sometimes metaphors and proverbs have a tendency to sanctify customs and traditions. And certain customs and traditions, and our Ethiopian culture is riddled with a plethora of them, with an infinite number of them, are not necessarily always progressive. There are certain customs and traditions that we own. Just because we own them, though, it doesn't mean that we cannot question their truth values. We must. And then when we question their truth values, through using the second method of philosophizing, the analytic method, what we uncover is that there are traditions and customs that we should internalize and make our own because they are useful. And there are traditions and customs we must dismantle, jettison, and reject completely. Classical Ethiopian philosophy then is replete with metaphors and proverbs that have served Ethiopians and our cultures for many, many years, just because they are there. Just because people feel comfortable with them, that they put them in comfort zones. When we examine their philosophical status, we'll sometimes discover that they are not as useful as we think, and in that we should empower ourselves courageously to dismantle them, to reject them, and to push back, and to maintain an autonomy and a distance from them. Modern Ethiopian philosophy then, embodied in the contributions of Ze'er Yacob, did exactly that. What makes Ze'er Yacob a modern Ethiopian philosopher is that he turned his back, in his case, totally and completely against traditions and customs. And most particularly, the traditions and customs that have been sanctified by priests who've been interpreting the Bible, and not necessarily truthfully, and not necessarily clearly, and not necessarily usefully, and not necessarily authentically, but by virtue of their priesthood. Ze'er Yacob, a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher, was very daring to tell priests, both Ethiopians and Europeans, that their reading of the Bible is mistaken. And he thought of the possibility of creating a society in which citizens who have decided to believe in God should not believe in God guided by the teachings of the priests, but rather by developing a personal relationship with God himself. It is this that makes Ze'er Yacob radically autonomous and extremely intelligent, which got him in trouble during the time in which he was questioning the Jesuits, because the Jesuits had come and introduced Catholicism to King Susianus, in spite of the fact that Ethiopia itself is the birthplace of Christianity. The great traditions in Aksum, the great traditions in other parts of Ethiopia, where Christians grew, where Christians fought, where Christians were persecuted, give one a vision of a society that has already developed a very sophisticated interpretation of what it means to be a Christian. And yet, the European Jesuits came to Ethiopia to convince the population that their understanding of Christianity needs to be overthrown. And in that, the whole society, mind you, they thought, needs to be rebaptized.
Mm.
The prevailing interpretation of Christianity on the Jesuit reading was barbarically inadequate, primitive, not sufficiently sophisticated to understand God. In spite of Ze'er Yacob's attempt, of course the Jesuits did not know this, at the founder, one of the founders of what we call Enlightenment, which is nothing more than a way by which one lives one's life through the usage of a God-given, a transcendental power called intelligence, that Ze'er Yacob thought was given to each and every human being. The Jesuits presupposed, sadly, that they did not think that these barbaric Ethiopians were equipped with this natural intelligence through which they could interpret what it means to believe and then create a society that is guided by Christian value systems. Ze'er Yacob radically questioned this. And of course, he paid a heavy price. It's his own countryman who sacrificed him. Who told the Jesuits, there is this dangerous Ethiopian who thinks that he's sovereign, who thinks that he's autonomous, and he's bad-mouthing you Jesuits. He thinks that you've come to our society to dismantle our practices, and he is preaching wild and dangerous ideas. This is an Ethiopian who sacrificed an Ethiopian, which led Ze'er Yacob to escape in the middle of the night, fled toward shore, and by the Kaza River, he managed to get a cave, entered that cave, in which he spent about 2 years until King Susianus was overthrown and King Fasilides returns to Ethiopia to restore Ethiopian Christianity. Ze'er Yacob returns to Ethiopia, and on his way of fetching home, he encounters a very wealthy Ethiopian whose name is Habtu, who invited him to his home and asked him to tutor his son. It's very much like the Plato and Aristotle relationship in European discourse, and Walter Heward is groomed and carefully cultivated by Ze'er Yacob to become a philosopher in his own right. And so Ethiopia then gave us two powerful thinkers, two powerful philosophers, a teacher and a student whom he groomed, whom he cultivated, not to take his place, but to interpret the master in his own way. And he seriously disagrees with the master, by the way. Walter Heward draws much more from classical Ethiopian philosophy, namely the proverbs, the songs, the metaphors, the customs and the traditions, and develops what I call social ethics out of them, whereas the Ze'er Yacob has completely jettisoned them. So here you sense a tension between the student and the teacher. The teacher is a radical, the student is a conservative traditionalist.
Thank you. You've definitely given us a general understanding of who Ze'er Yacob is and the historical time period that he existed and lived in. So to talk more about his own philosophy, you talk about Hateta and Hasesa. Could you tell us how Ze'er Yacob uses those two and what exactly are they?
I love that question. Now, let me return now, if you allow me, at the expense of being unnecessarily loquacious, but in analytic philosophy, which is the kind of philosophy that I do, we tend to believe in repetitions. Not necessarily because we're so ego-centered, but we think that repetitions sometimes clarify, specify thought. So let me return then to my earlier introductions of what I call the methodic doubt, in the case of the Descartes, that you doubt everything until after you develop appropriate proofs and evidences to yourself and to those for whom you're writing, that whatever you think exists. And in this case, in the case of Descartes, it was God, which I contrasted with that of Ze'er Yacob, which I called methodic belief, in order to engage in the very practice of doubting, which is what Descartes is doing. Ze'er Yacob, unlike Descartes, did not think that you need to doubt the existence of God, but on the contrary, you must believe that God exists in order for God to give you the appropriate intelligence through which, for analytic purposes, you might then want to doubt his existence. But not at the difference. You're not going to doubt his existence because you think that he doesn't exist. You're going to doubt his existence because you know that he exists, but that you want to test your intelligence and see how far you can go with the doubting, because you are going to eventually end up believing in God anyway. Now, methodic doubt for Descartes and methodic belief for Ze'er Yacob led now Ze'er Yacob to develop two methods of thinking, as I call them. And here I would like our tradition to be proud of me. What I am trying to do, however inadequately, is create an Ethiopian canon in philosophy. Through these unique methods that Ze'er Yacob developed, which I called Hasasa and Hatata in Gibbs. By Hatata, Ze'er Yacob essentially means meditating, praying, relentlessly, with a committed passion, every day, every second, every minute of your existence, wondering where this God is, what this God is made out of, whether he can reach this God through the five senses that I spoke about earlier, in a way that he could do tables and chairs. Whether you're even qualified, you're even capacitated to imagine the nature of this God. And yet, your life will be an attempt at inquiring about the greatness of this creator. Remember, God for him is so great that he cannot imagine anything greater, which is an argument very similar that we philosophers call the ontological argument that a saint by the name of Saint Anselm developed a few centuries before Ze'er Yacob. He too conceived of God. Look at the similarities, centuries apart, but remarkable similarities, the imaginary and passion. Saint Anselm also conceived of God when asked what God is. God is that greater than whom I cannot imagine. And that greater than whom I cannot imagine, he said, is not only great in abstraction because I think that is great. No, on the contrary, he is great because he could create himself. And that which could create himself must necessarily be the greatest, because I know of no human being or other kinds of beings who can create themselves. Only this God, greater than whom I cannot imagine, is equipped with this extraordinary power, from which then St. Anselm concluded that God exists. So Ze'er Yacob now is meditating about this greatness, you see. So great, evident maybe in the skies, the stars, the earth, the trees, the ecology as a whole. And if you see very clearly in the morning, at night, you can't help but wonder about nature. Maybe God is present in this nature. Maybe God is in the tree. Maybe God is in the human. Maybe God is in trees and plants and other matters. Now, the question is, I can't see him. I can't touch him. I can't smell him. I can't talk to him. But I know that he exists. And I want to uncover this existence. I want to develop a relationship with this existence. But how am I going to do it? I must inquire. I must meditate. I must pray, which leads me, Hewitt, to contrast this with a major female philosopher by the name of Saint Teresa of Jesus, who said, when asked, Saint Teresa, does God exist? She said, of course he exists in uncertain terms. They asked her, how do you know that he exists? And she said, I sense it. I feel his presence. Additionally, she said, have you ever seen God? She was asked. Of course I saw him. What does he look like? No, I can't tell you what he looks like. He's enigmatic. He's undefinable. He's elusive. He appears and disappears. But I've seen him. How did you see him? Did you see him with your eyes? No. I saw him with the eyes of my soul. Special kinds of eyes. Not the bodily eyes, but the eyes of the soul, she said. Which presupposes that one must believe, not everybody does, that there is something called soul, which is distinct from the body. See?
Mm-hmm.
Bodies exist by virtue of the fact that we sense them through the five senses. Souls are undetectable. We can't verify their existence. Saint Teresa verified the existence of God by contending that she saw him through the eyes of her soul, noting and admitting that she couldn't possibly have seen him through the bodily eyes, human eyes. But he equipped her with special kinds of eyes, through which she saw him, she says, in stages. She describes those stages. They are unbelievable. First, his feet, because he did not want to dazzle me. He did not want to frighten me. He did not want me to run away from him, overwhelmed by his radiance, by his extraordinary presence. So he revealed himself to me in stages, slowly, through his bodily parts, one at a time. And then she said, I have been praying all my life. I have been meditating. I've been engaging in hatata for him to privilege me with this incredible visual sight of actually seeing him for seconds, and then disappeared. And she adds, after I saw him, my life changed. For the first time in my life, she said, I was peaceful, patient, generous, compassionate, truthful, kind, attentive, vigilant, aware, conscious. I was given powers and possibilities that were inherently absent in my earlier life until that encounter, that visual encounter of this transcendent. Ze'er Yacob claims something similar. He says, when I spent 2 years in that cave, equipped only with the mind that the Creator gave me, the intelligence through which I look for him, through which I engage in hasasa, looking, desperately looking, searching, metasis, searching, hoping that after this passionate search, that he too would experience what Saint Teresa experienced in the 13th century, a visual encounter of this transcendent. Unlike her, he doesn't say he saw him, but he certainly says, in that cave, I felt a companionship, a peace, a tranquility, a fulfillment that I have never seen when I was with human beings. Human beings, he sadly argues, are disappointed. He says they are liars. They are lazy. They are sluggish. They are self-centered. They are excessively self-regarding. They do not embrace others in them. Instead, they otherize others. They otherize their neighbors. And this, in spite of the teaching of the Bible. The first and most powerful commandment of which is loving your neighbor. And a neighbor, of course, is loving a human being like you. Loving you, he would, and you loving me. By virtue of our humanity. We are not capable of doing this. Instead, what do we specialize in? We reduce ourselves into ethnicities, into nationalities, into members of genders, into members of sexes, into members of races, into members of class, as if all these other human beings who are suffering are fated to suffer precisely because of us. By this standard, Ze'er Yacob is one of the harshest critiques of the human that I have never had the honor to read. Whatever I know, he says in the Hadata, I learned deeply and purely in 2 years inside that cave when I stood away from these humans. Sources of tremendous displeasure, tremendous disappointment, creators of wars, creators of suffering, unnecessary wars, unnecessary suffering, consequences of the misuse of human intelligence.
Yeah.
This is Ze'er Yacob. He spares no one, my sister. Not even his own self. Critical of Muslims, critical of Christians. And this you will love, Hewitt. When the merchant invited him to tutor a child, which he did. And then there was a maid. I hate that term. Human beings are not maids.
Mm-hmm.
A helper would be more appropriate to call this human being. Ze'er Yacob, it seems, fell in love with her. And then he told his benefactor, I would like to marry. His benefactor said, you can, but in the meantime, I'll give you a maid. He told him to his face, she's not a maid. She's the woman I love and whom I would like to marry. Look now, Hewitt, how Ze'er Yacob practiced the jettisoning of traditions and customs. He married her, and when asked, Why did he like her? He did not torture her into bones. He did not speak about her bodily parts. He said, she's kind and intelligent. Nothing else mattered for him. Not class, not wealth, not the caste system that we Ethiopians have specialized in. Here again, you have the birth of a unique philosopher in the Ethiopian soil who is practicing what he's preaching. By African standards, Ze'er Yacob was our first feminist.
Absolutely.
To answer your question directly, two methods. One, hatata, meditation, inquiry, developing a prayerful attitude in a relationship with God. Hatata, looking for that about whom you're praying. Relentless searching, committed searching, without any guarantee that God is going to reveal himself to you. The joy, the prayerfulness, the reward is not in the realization of what you're looking for in the form of an outcome, but the searching itself, the commitment. When others are destroying nations, producing wars, contributing to human suffering, Ze'er Yacob is solitarily looking for this God, engaging in hasasa. These two methods of developing a relationship with God are distinctly African, distinctly Ethiopian, and I would like us to develop an Ethiopian canon in the history of philosophy out of them. So we have Methodic belief, hasasa, and hatata, that we can take extraordinary pride in as potent sources of what it means to be a thinker, of what it means to be a reflective mind, of what it means to believe in God. That you must engage both in hatata and hasasa. And what you uncover is a unique personal relationship with God, which cannot be gotten here. Here you will condemn me by going to churches and then gossiping about human beings when you're inside churches. You couldn't even wait until the sermon is over before you begin gossiping and condemning other human beings. And you think that you've had a religious experience. No, you haven't. You haven't internalized the method. The method is love of human beings with all their flaws, because they are by definition flawed, because they are born imperfectly. You do not hold the fact that they are imperfect, therefore sometimes ignorant, against them. You love them even more. Do we do this? You will challenge me. Do we do this in our churches?
We do not. Unfortunately, we do not.
Think about the implications of that for our Ethiopian condition. Our Ethiopian condition is a consequence of this negligence, because we haven't internalized love yet. We do not know what it means to love. To love is to embrace imperfection, you want.
Yeah.
No imperfections now. I'm sure I'm saddling you with so many imperfect propositions and sillinesses that are coming out of my mouth. Because I'm not a God. But I'm a human being who is attempting to think through life, in the process of which I may annoy you, antagonize you, not deliberately, but as a consequence of my imperfection. How many Ethiopians that you know have this kind of relationships with themselves? We're the types of human beings who even celebrate the death of human beings. You what? It is this mess, this murky water that Ze'er Yacob was attempting to correct in the 17th century. And he paid heavily for it. He didn't have friends. I don't know about you. I don't have friends at all. I'm alone. Because I don't want to be a game player. Like Ze'er Yacob before me. He influenced me and told me, Tedros, human beings are liars. It takes tremendous discipline not to lie. And not lying begins with what? With not lying to yourself. Here we have a powerful thinker here. What if we read him, if we introduce them in our kindergartens, in our curricula, I promise you, our society will be radically different 10 generations from now. But the work has to begin now. Mm-hmm. This awareness. And it begins with self-examination, Ewart. It's so difficult to examine yourself. I know.
As you're perfect. I think that we have this assumption that we see other people's faults, but we have a hard time seeing our own, shortcomings, which makes it really difficult to examine yourself, doesn't it?
You said it so well. Exactly right. I can't tell you have to trust me. When this interview is over, and I'm going to miss the interview, I'm going to go back and think about what I've said. And I'll discover that it's flawed.
Yeah.
And if you give me a second opportunity, come back and talk about moral philosophy, I'll revisit every proposition that I have made, because I will have grown wiser by a few months from now. It is this humility, I think, that is missing in the human condition. And we Ethiopians in particular, in spite of what comes out of our mouths, are arrogant, judgmental, unforgiving. How could he fail to forgive a human being who, by definition, is subject to be forgiven in order for you to live with that human being? Because he or she is imperfect by definition. How could he hold my mistakes against me forever and take them to the casket instead of lovingly helping me to correct them with love and attention? These are my demands from human beings, Ewart. And because I cannot get them, I have decided loneliness as a way of living. Much more fulfilling. Yes, I miss the parties. We Ethiopians are fantastic at eating together. But we're so horrible at the art of living with others.
But to ask you a question here, isn't that at the same time, though, what Ze'er Yacob says about love, right? Even though people are liars, even though people do struggle being the best that they could, the possibility of God giving us a perfection, also the possibility of us seeing our own imperfection and being able to forgive someone else for their imperfection. Isn't that what it means to live in a community and to love everyone around us?
Precisely. Exactly right. Which we don't do. We noticed that we Ethiopians specialize in making him a virtue. Imagine that. A virtue like it. Look at that self-description.
Yeah.
What are you really saying? Who are you to hold grudges against another human being like you? When he or she messes up, why are you not willing to forgive and move on? Why should this lead to wars? And how are we going to end this process of conditioning?
Yeah.
How? And when? We are inheritors of a world effective civilization, the birthplace of humanity, mind you. And yet, look at our modern condition. Having lived for so long, and look at what other civilizations and empires have done, and look at where we are. It is these flaws that Ze'er Yacob is examining. Walter Heward, on the other hand, was a politician, like the politicians that we have now. He closed his eyes to them. Ze'er Yacob did not close his eyes. In the name of philosophy, Ze'er Yacob took the route of radical thinking as a way of life. Because for him, honesty is a crucial virtue. He does not seek to deceive God with lies. He prays to this God to cleanse him from lies, because he too, as a human being, knows he's a liar. The difference is, he's not a liar who thinks that lying is a virtue. He's a liar who knows that lying is a vice. And when he's engaged in hasasa and hatata, his beginning is always the following: make me a person who is examining you and examining myself in the process. Can you imagine what human life would look like, Heward, if we took these unbound possibilities that humans are endowed with to examine ourselves before we speak, before we act, before we condemn others, before we kill them, before we invite them to wars, before we exploit them, before we put them in caste systems, before we ignore them? If we ask that question, am I in good condition? Is my soul in good condition? Can I be trusted to be a friend of another human being when my condition is not good? It's not a matter of dating. It's not a matter of entering marriages. It's not a matter of establishing relationships because you can. It's a matter of asking that hard question. Am I in good condition to live with others? And if you're not, it's time to do the work. And the work is done alone. Have you noticed that we Ethiopians cannot even be by ourselves? Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
We can.
Mm-hmm. Like if you decide to say, no, I just don't feel like being around people, everybody would just say like, wait, what's wrong with you? Like, what's going on? Like, is there something you want to share with us? The idea of really being alone and really taking the time to reflect what's going on in our lives is not much advertised. I think in one sense, I appreciate it because it's that community care and community love. But then in the other sense, like you said, there's never really a moment for us to figure out who we really are and what we really like and don't like, and the different things that we need to work on ourselves, as long as there's a party going on around us, right? There's never a quiet moment for us to reflect on the things around us. So yeah, it's an interesting culture we have.
It's incredible the way you broke it down. It sounds even better than the way I presented. Hopefully.
I know that.
It really is. You capture the essence of it. Yes.
Mhm.
Don't we have to be by ourselves sometimes to take stock of the day? What did I do today?
Mhm.
Whom did I insult? Whom did I annoy? Whom did I ignore? Whom did I fail to greet? Whom did I give that bad look? Whom? This could occupy the self for 2-3 hours a day. You take a stock of the day. I understand that we work extremely hard. I understand that. At full-time positions that we don't necessarily want. The parking lots, the restaurants. I understand all that.
Yeah.
That is also an obstructing path. And for that, Hewart, you'll have to invite me to break down capitalism and how it contributes to this, which is another discussion.
I would love to for sure. I'd like to invite our guest to share and like this conversation, and we'll take a quick break and continue our conversation.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምብኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome back, everyone. We are having a conversation with Professor Tedros Kiros about the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher Ze'er Yacob, as we know him. And I'd just like to remind everyone that we do have two Ze'er Yacobs in Ethiopian history. One is a king, the other one is a philosopher. We're talking about the philosopher today. Welcome back, everyone. And I guess I want to ask you first about the title of your book. The title of your book, which is Ze'er Yacob, The Rationality of the Human Heart. I ask this question because when we think about philosophy and rationality, we think about the mind and thinking. So why the human heart?
That's an incredible question. In fact, as you know, in the book that you've read so carefully, I sense intuitively that you've done that.
Mm-hmm.
The heart, not necessarily because it's the most privileged organ, because all the organs of the body must be sufficiently perfect in order for the human body to function adequately. It would be nonsensical to think and say, I love my heart, but I don't like my kidney. That would be stupid. But the heart has a special place in Ze'er Yacob's thinking. Long before Ze'er Yacob, the Egyptians in particular used to choose human hearts and mummify them. As you know, the ancient Egyptians, among their other achievements, were also master doctors. I think they were the first to carry human surgery. And for them, the brain, this is about 2,500 years ago, in contrast to the heart, was not as important. It's as if they knew that the brain, a physical organ, strictly speaking, which is made out of cells, has limited capacities. Yes, the brain, certain parts of it, enable us, for example, to produce words so that we can speak. And through speech, we communicate, and through communication, as you would say, we form communities. They know all this. But they used to suck it out and throw it. In contrast to the billions of dollars that modern societies invest on brain research, and not so much on heart research. The Egyptians thought differently. For them, what they called thinking, which is an attempt at becoming conscious as opposed to knowledgeable. There is a difference between knowing something and being conscious of something.
What's the difference?
Consciousness is a sort of a mystical. We do not know what consciousness is still. But we do know, or we think we know, certain kinds of knowledges. Medical knowledge is one of them, for example. But we do not know what underlies those things which we think we know. But what underlies the things we know is what the Egyptians are after, because they're after consciousness. And for them, the heart is the place of this consciousness. They made distinctions very early on between the brain and what you call the mind. Because if you notice, in our modern parlance, we have a tendency to think that the brain and the mind are the same. They are not. The brain is the physical manifestation of the mind. And the mind is the superstructure of the brain that the brain does not know anything about. It can't. Remember Ze'er Yacob's conception of human perfection. We're partly imperfect as a consequence of the imperfection of the brain through which we know. And the perfection that we seek, not that we could ever attain it, could be gotten only if we penetrate consciousness. The heart, then, for these ancient Egyptians, was the place of this consciousness, was the place of thinking. In an article that I have developed, which I invite you to read, which appeared in a rather prestigious website publication called the Art Institute, I think. I like developing analytic devices always. That's how my mind works. I developed distinctions between what I call scientific rationality and the rationality of the human heart. Scientific rationality is invariably guided by the brain. All the knowledge that we're accumulating as a consequence of brain research, which are modalities of knowledge, are useful, but only up to a point. Or at the rationality of the heart, which is the set of consciousness, which we do not pay attention to, has yet to be uncovered, has yet to be studied. In Ze'er Yacob, the heart plays this role. It functions as a set of consciousness, so that when I'm interacting with you as a human being, that which might make it possible for me to treat you as well as I treat myself is the consciousness that you are in me and I am in you. That is a higher form of thinking. Because analytically, Heward is Heward by virtue of the fact that she's not Tedros. Tedros is Tedros by virtue of the fact that he's not Heward, just like the tables and chairs relationships with which I began.
Mm-hmm.
But when he accesses consciousness, what he uncovers is the humanity that binds you and me, which would make it possible for me to harm you, to hurt you, to neglect you, to abuse you, to exploit you, because to do so is to do so to myself. Because consciousness unites us. But we've forgotten this unity. How many people that you know think that you are in them and they are in you? Look at the role that race, gender, class, ethnicity, and caste play in our lives, Seward. They account for our fragmentation, for the divisions created by the brain, because the brain is a divider. Consciousness is a uniter. What is consciousness? Consciousness is an attempt at penetrating what the Christian thinks God is. And when you penetrate God, when you fully become one with Him, how is it possible for you to abuse any human being? You shouldn't. And sometimes, trust me, you can't. Hence, the references to the human heart in Ze'er Yacob are about 85 of them. Le bon.
Bon.
He never mentions the brain.
Mm.
And he has never heard of the Egyptians. But he was a master reader of the Psalms of David. And if you notice the Psalms, when David is desperate because he was a womanizer, desperate because he was greedy, he always prayed to God and asked Him to free him from these flaws. I know not what I'm doing. Put me on green pastures, he tells him. You are my shield and my rock. I don't fear death, although I move in the shadow of the valley of death. Because you are in me, because you have environed me, because you have saturated my existence, because I love you, because I'm looking for you, because I'm inquiring for you. Do not ignore me. Speak to me, God.
I love that. That's beautiful.
You see,
Mm-hmm.
when you develop a relationship with consciousness, your life begins to change completely. All the divisions disappear. You begin to experience life as a whole. The master Indian thinkers, the sages of the great India, in some of their masterpieces, such as the Upanishads, I invite you, if you get a chance, I don't mean to be arrogant, to read my last book, Self-Definition. A philosophical inquiry from the global south to the global north, which begins with Egypt and then ends with the US. In the Upanishads, there is this remarkable passage in which the sage speaks about separateness. Separateness, he says, is the enemy of the human. Once you begin to separate yourself, not only from human beings, even from plants and animals and so on, then you carelessly destroy them. Hence, the destruction of the environment itself is ground upon the separateness that we have canonized in our relationship with non-human beings. Imagine the implications of that separateness and the way in which it pervades our relationships with one another.
I think maybe, sorry.
Please.
If I can reflect a little bit, maybe you could correct me if I'm thinking about it not quite right. But I wonder maybe if we should start thinking about the individual as sacrosanct as opposed to the group, right? Because I feel like once we start thinking about in a group, like you said earlier, if I start thinking about, like, as a Black person, if I start thinking about as a woman before I start thinking about myself as an individual, then it makes it difficult for me to relate to that one individual, right? Because now I'm automatically going to see your group that you belong in. And by doing that, I'm effectively taking away the humanity from you. So I could treat you however way I can, because that understanding of you as a human being, than me as a human being, has been separated or othered to create that separation between the two of us. Is that where you're going with that?
You nailed it. Exactly. I am going after identity politics. Mercilessly.
Yeah.
I'm going after the function of race, gender, and class in our lives. There's a sense in which we must respect what we could do through them. How can we ignore the role that race has played in the production of slavery, for example? To that extent, yes, we have to recognize the mendacious role that race has played. But look at the difference. There is a difference between recognizing the mendacity that race has played in our lives and from treating it as a source of what it means to be a human being. As you put it, the ultimate source is this consciousness that unites us. Not the race, gender, and sex that divide us. Just because they have been used to divide us, it doesn't mean that we have to subscribe to them. On the contrary, we better develop somber and patient techniques of freeing ourselves from the way that these identities are corrupting us and blocking our possibilities. For that, you need to access consciousness to discover the human. This might sound idealistic. Trust me, it's not. I don't know how many generations it's going to take. But unless we embark on this path, the wars and the sufferings that have become second nature are not going to end by public policy.
Yeah. The
self has to do a foundational, fundamental rethinking of what it means to be a human being, of what the Upanishads have called separateness. Once we overcome separateness, it becomes logically impossible to mistreat others. Logically impossible. There is no other to mistreat because you have removed the other from the human gaze. I think. Correct me. I may be claiming too much. I've been thinking about it for many years. And sometimes it's very dangerous to be so certain. And I'm by no means certain of what I'm defending. I'm merely attempting to defend propositions that need to be filled out with other alternatives and perspectives. But this is what I've learned from life thus far.
Yeah, I think sometimes even if one thought is wrong, not that to say your thoughts are wrong, but even to give it a chance, right? And instead of doing the same thing over and over and over again, maybe let's try something else. Let's try something that might be a bit different. That might also be not as intuitive as we like to be. But I would argue here that I think first looking at ourselves, understanding our relationship with our God, and being able to think about myself first and foremost in a fuller sense, I don't think it's very, for me at least, it's very intuitive. So sometimes I might have a harder time understanding why I should care about my group before I care about myself. But I see that sometimes that could be seen as selfish or self-centered. But I would argue that first I should think about myself and be able to think about myself and be comfortable in myself and who I am before I could think for you.
Incredible. The great Frantz Fanon, I modestly suggest to you, you sound like a very smart young person to me, a Martinican philosopher, who is the author of such famous texts such as Black Skin and White Masks, The Wretched of the Earth. You should check him out.
Okay.
And The Wretched of the Earth famously says, every generation has to choose its own mission. I think your generation, to quote you, has to choose the mission of trying this possibility that I'm attempting to philosophically defend, which I'm describing as penetrating consciousness and developing resources through which we can further penetrate consciousness to uncover the layers of our humanity which continue to be burdened, darkened, and covered by race, gender, and sex. So the mission of your generation should be the search for the human.
Mm-hmm.
Because the human is absent. Trust me on that. What you have are machine-like beings, separate like atoms. We have to take this untested path of Hasasa and Hatata to enter the zone of consciousness as a mission that your generation could choose. And I want you to think particularly as an Ethiopian and develop a mission of saving Ethiopia, which is on the verge of destruction. Your generation has to look for the human, to go beyond the wars, the deaths of human beings that we're celebrating. I'm speaking ambiguously, but you're so smart that you do understand me. I think you do.
Yeah.
What a catastrophe to celebrate death when we should be mourning and crying. How could we dare to celebrate the death of 18 and 19-year-olds who have not even lived their lives fully? How dare we celebrate? What is there to celebrate? But there is much to condemn. Remember my words, Seward. The search for the human is a mission of your generation. And when you look for the human, and if you uncover the presence of that human, the morass and bewildering sufferings that we have made second nature become self-abolishing.
Mm-hmm.
And as you put it well, we have to examine ourselves as individuals, as individual Ethiopians, and ask the question, am I healthy? My impression is that we Ethiopians are now collectively sick. Let's face this fact. And Ze'er Yacob was the first to diagnose this sickness in the 17th century and condemned the Catholics, the Protestants, the Muslims, the Jews who are misinterpreting and distorting the idea of God to justify wars. We are doing the same. from it.
No, not at all. I full-heartedly agree on this, and I really hope my generation can take up that challenge of looking for the human first and foremost within ourselves. Because once we find it in ourselves, it's easy to see it in somebody else as well. But to kind of end on a high note, maybe, what does Ze'er Yacob say about the human possibility?
Not much. He was a pessimist, Stewart.
Mm.
Unlike me, who is attempting to give you a mission, not that you need a mission, but I dare to give you one. And you humbly and lovingly accepted it.
Mm.
Ze'er Yacob, I think, gave up. There are no hopeful notes in the Hadat. None. No prescriptions. Except for serving his own soul. He internalized the diseases of the century as irredeemable. So he chose the path of at least redeeming himself.
Yeah.
Don't you feel that way sometimes? When you look around you and it's so gloomy. There are only two paths left. Either the path of isolation or the path of total engagement. Look in the context of this country, how exciting the beginnings of the movement called Black Lives Matter was. And look how forgetful we human beings are. It became hijacked.
Mm-hmm.
And now the world is back to business again.
Yeah.
But we could do better, I think, because we're members of a powerful civilization. Powerful, much more powerful than we know. But we're abusing it. And sometimes, if there is God, He doesn't give us too many chances. He gave us greatness, and we are destroying it. I can't even read news anymore, Hewart.
Yeah, it's
When I
disheartening.
think about the Ethiopian condition. Sometimes I don't even want to get up because I'm going to hear about someone vanquishing home and someone declaring victory, someone lying.
Yeah.
And the nation is burning. But of course, you did not invite me today to address this particular condition. You asked me to address.
It's definitely a good segue in a sense, so that it's not all philosophical. Maybe we could bring it down to earth and see exactly how we could relate to the things that Ze'er Yacob was saying to the day-to-day life of others. And so, as such, maybe how much of his work do you think has influenced the culture and traditions of modern-day Ethiopia?
Sad to say, Hewart, I don't want to sound too skeptical. None.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think my book, which some philosophers consider to be quite important,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think why, is known in Ethiopia. Remember, I'm going to be very blunt with you. There is something about you that I liked, and I'm going to be blunt. I'm going to take a risk and be blunt. There are people who do not even read my work based on my name. I'll leave it there.
How do you mean based on your name?
I'll let you figure that out.
No, I'm asking because I think it's an important conversation for us to be had in the sense of understanding who we are as human beings.
I can't tell you
Yeah.
how honored I felt when you invited me. Honored. This is the first time that I have been asked to speak about my work, and I have published 16 books, Hewart. Nobody knows me in my country because I'm Tedros. I have been narrated. I've been stereotyped already, Hewitt.
Yeah.
They don't even have to know me. They know me because of that name. They also know what I could possibly say and not say, Hewitt. This is where we are in modern Ethiopia. But you honored me with this invitation, and I hope I have not disappointed.
Not at all. This has been an absolute pleasure for me to have this conversation with you, even really to listen in and truly understand. I think reading the book is one thing, but having to talk to you and really see the thought behind the words that you put down is really amazing. And even really to truly understand, we do have philosophers, we do have African thought leaders that we can look up to, we can learn from, because I could pick up a book by John Locke and read, right? And it's still definitely an amazing thought that to contemplate on. But to have someone that understands the culture I come from, the religion I come from, and that upbringing that we might share even, and to say, these are the things that we could think about, and these are the things we should think about to better our society, to better ourselves, and to fix the broken system of our country. And so it's definitely pleasure for me as well for you to have accepted this invitation. We'll take a quick break and come back and have more conversation about actually your work specifically and how we could participate in it. And for those of you that are watching us, please go ahead and share and like this conversation. Also, we like to remind everyone that the comments that you put down has to be positive and supporting and helpful for the community that we're trying to build here per the Adebabay media standards. Thank you, and we'll be right back.
Adebabay media የኔ ነው Adebabay media የኔም ነው
አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔ ነው
Adebabay media የሁላችንም ነው
የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል የእናንተስ
Do your parents watch Adebabay media?
Watch, follow, subscribe and help አደባባይ አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ
Welcome, everyone. And we're having a conversation with Professor Tedros Kiros about the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher Ze'er Yacob. And I really encourage everyone to go and read this book that Professor Tedros Kiros has written, and really breaking it down and even giving us comparison with a famous philosopher, another famous philosopher that we know, a Western philosopher, Descartes, and really be able to familiarize ourselves with Ze'er Yacob and how that looks like in our day-to-day life. So just to talk a little bit about the work that you do, myself and my producer was also surprised that you were in the music department. So how is philosophy and music related, and what do you tend to achieve with your students as far as teaching them philosophy?
I love that. I love that question because I love my students, both at Berkeley and at Harvard. I'm also a professor of philosophy in the summer school at Harvard University. And I teach two different audiences. Musicians at Berkeley, gifted, extraordinary musicians, and very nerdy, very bright, very conscious, and very willing to change the world at Harvard. Very aware. But there is something special about musicians, I've learned, having been teaching them at Berkeley for the past 13 years. At the expense of sounding self-serving. I know you're very busy. But if you were to Google ratemyprofessors.com, you'll discover that there are about 300 and some evaluations of my classes at Berkeley. These are musicians, mind you. Extremely hardworking. It's only after I began teaching at Berkeley that I came to respect the world of the artist, the world of the musician. You're talking about students who were to rehearse between 10 and 12 hours a day to master an instrument. Some of them are motivated by the likes of musicians such as the great Coltrane, the saxophonist of saxophonists, one of the greatest American musicians, an African American, Coltrane, who is famously remembered when he was extremely young that his mother would discover that he has been practicing the horn the whole night. And then when she came to the bathroom, she would mentally take out the horn from his mouth because he had fallen asleep while he was practicing. The kind of musicians that I teach at Berkeley really live for that music. They know it's a very risky business where in a given century you're going to have maybe 3 or 4 celebrities. And each and every student who is admitted at Berkeley is gifted. At a given time, there may be about 100 guitarists at Berkeley. Imagine how these 100 guitarists are going to distinguish themselves because each and every one of them is a gifted guitarist. And then on the average, a typical Berkeley student graduates with at least a debt of $85,000. And then it is not unusual for me when I walk through downtown Boston to see some of my brightest students working away at Starbucks, breaking their back during the day to pay the debt, and then exhausted at the end of the day to go home and continue practicing because the musician's practice is founded on continuous practice, or else you rust. Because every musician is doing that. And then they choose my courses at Berkeley. I have developed a minor in philosophy myself. There was a minor before I joined Berkeley from Brown University, which is where I came from. But I developed it further. And it's now a one-man department. I teach aesthetics, ethics, introduction to Western philosophy, philosophy of religion, philosophy of literature, Eastern philosophy. In a single day, my life begins at 11 o'clock in the morning, say, with introduction to Western philosophy, and it ends at 7 with my last course in the philosophy of religion. I'm carrying global literature in my mind every day. And then there are the students. Once I introduce them to philosophy, particularly Ze'er Yacob, I'm not exaggerating, they consume him like they consume their instruments. They shock me with their master and their openness because I'm creating a new world for them. There's a famous course of mine called Africana Philosophy, which I teach both at Berkeley and at Harvard. Students flock to this course the moment it appears on the catalog. The next day, 20 students register for it. It's heavily textbook ridden. At Harvard in particular, they tell me, give us more to read. Because they can. They have time. At Berkeley, they don't have time. So imagine what they are sacrificing to please me. In addition to their rehearsals, which they do at night, they devote their days to master the texts that I'm giving them. I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah.
The songwriters in particular, who know that I'm also a novelist, take my character seriously, and they write songs. And I always tell them, my dream at Berkeley, before I die, is to at least produce 2 or 3 world jet-setting musicians who think philosophically, who think about consciousness, to ground everything that I have said in my work at Berkeley. When I die, I'm going to be remembered by these musicians. I feel it in my bones, not by Ethiopians. Nobody knows. You're the first Ethiopian, an educated Ethiopian, that I'm having the honor to engage, and I hope I'm not disappointed. My work is not known in my own homeland.
Yeah.
My work is known in the West. The West respected me. The West gave me an opportunity to be the head of philosophy in a racist society at Berklee College of Music. You can imagine the pride that I see gleaming and glowing in my African American students when they take my courses and see the way I do my gig. The pride, the sense of achievement, sense of, wow, there's a dark-skinned human being who could do what I have been told only whites could do. He's not only playing ball. He's not only dancing. He's not only getting caught in crimes, but setting the stage, giving humanity a new mission. And I take my work at Berkeley seriously. Do you know why? Human beings love music.
Yeah.
And if I could enter philosophy and create an environment for them to internalize the values that I'm fighting for, it would only take one singer, one song to develop the consciousness of the world and produce a musician who thinks. It's not enough, as Rihanna does, to produce songs that say, dance, dance, dance. Now, you should not only be numbing pain, we should be addressing the issues that are producing pain.
Yeah.
And philosophy is precisely that medication that I try to give to musicians.
I love that. You're making me want to go back and look at my playlists to make sure it has a little bit of conscious into it, I guess. So I have 2 questions to ask you, but I'll start with this one. What are the contributions of Ethiopia to the world that you think beside Ze'er Yacob, as we just discussed, and also specifically to the Africana studies?
There was a time in my life when being an Ethiopian, when I came around your age to the US, was a source of pride. When I could talk about Dinkinesh, Lucy, when I could talk about the churches of Lalibela, when I could talk about the master religious texts in Aksum that produced Ze'er Yacob, when I could talk about our cuisines, when I could talk about musicians. I love Adebabay.
Oh, me too.
I say.
Yeah.
I love Mahmoud
Mhm.
Ahmed. I love these musicians. But then I began not being proud of my nation anymore. Precisely for what I've been glibly talking about. The callousness, the cruelty, and the hidden racisms that we have made second nature now. When I tell my Berkeley students proudly about Lucy, and then when they're going to read about our wars, how do you think I feel in the classroom? Shame. And now, when we're going out of our way and destroying our national treasures, these hard-won infrastructures that we have developed over the past 30 years, to put a Baroda, a Mekelle, an Adwa, an Addis Ababa on the trajectory of the developmental path. And because of ignorance, misunderstanding, producing wars now that are destroying them. What is there to be proud of, Hewitt? To answer your question, at this stage of our development, please don't hate me. Appreciate my effort at being truthful.
Yes.
I'm not proud of being Ethiopian. I'm rather ashamed. That's why the mission that I have respectfully given you and the mission that you have lovingly accepted is a mission that has to revive Ethiopia's greatness so that once again Ethiopia could be a beacon of hope, a beacon of sovereignty, a beacon of change. The Ethiopia that fought the Italians in Adwa, the Ethiopia that built the churches of Lalibela, the Ethiopia that built Aksum, the Ethiopia that gave us Ze'er Yacob could be the same Ethiopia in which we can live outside of the gates of separateness, in search of the human. In this instance, the Ethiopian human, who is radically absent now. That is the discourse that I want to engage. And I'm currently writing a book after I finish these two novels, which I would like to call An Ethiopian Tragedy, which is a relentless critique of the war, this unnecessary war that is going to traumatize and scar us for generations to come. Complicating the lives of loving human beings like you, from what I sense, who would be otherized. This is what we've done.
Absolutely. I can't wait to read it. And I know I have quite a lot of your work that I still need to catch on, but I'm thankful and grateful that I found your job for sure. And speaking of that, and future events, before you go, I want to have a promise from you. I know that you have been working on an alternative framework for justice that looks at the global South. Could you tell us a little bit about that, just what your vision is for that, and then also along that promise to come back and tell us more about what that means and how that looks like for us?
I think you're referring to my work. The first version of it appeared when I was, I think, 28 years old. My first book, rather my second book, called Moral Philosophy and Development, the Human Condition in Africa, in which I developed back then what I called two principles of justice. I call the first principle a principle that should be constitutionally mandated, in which food, shelter, clothing, and hate and health should be extended to all human beings without discrimination across the continent before we could move to the second principle of justice, which is a principle that enshrines liberties, religious freedoms, and cultural freedoms, linguistic freedoms, freedoms of all modalities, freedoms of all kinds. I contended in that book that many think is seminal before I wrote the book on Ze'er Yacob, that we should write a continental constitution, an African constitution, in which our development projects must be guided by these two principles of justice, such that until after we fully, completely, adequately, generously, and compassionately equip each and every human being with food, shelter, clothing, and health, we shouldn't be moving to this second principle of justice, to defend freedoms, religious freedoms, cultural freedoms, and political freedoms. Because for the African setting, the first principle is paramount. The second principle is luxurious. This was about 25 years ago. And then when I discovered ancient Egypt, I read a little bit of hieroglyphics. I uncovered a principle, a feminine principle, that the Egyptians called Ma'at, M-A-A-T, which is a principle that embodies compassion, truth, generosity, and something like empathy. I said to myself, the two principles of justice that I defended on philosophical grounds about 20 years ago are abstract. In order for these two principles of justice to work, because the principles seem to be quite attractive in their own right, there is a prior question that we have to attend to. The question of what I and you have now called the search for the human. What does it mean to be a human being? The ancient Egyptians used the idea of Ma'at to contend that the human is completely human if he or she embodies thoroughly compassion, justice, truth, and empathy in dealing with oneself and in dealing with others. If that is the case, then the capitalist framework that has naturalized greed and selfishness to be natural dimensions of the human being would have to be completely dismantled and replaced by Ma'at, so that we can from early on consciously develop human beings who value compassion, truth, empathy, and generosity as facets of their very being, as practices of the human self. for which the human self has to be individually accountable. So when the human is falsely propelled by greed and selfishness, because he or she have been told that greed and selfishness are natural. But if the Egyptians are right, once we embody the principles of Ma'at, the compassion, the generosity, the truth, the kindness and empathy, then that which we think has become natural to us, namely greed and selfishness, could be easily overthrown. And to defend the second and critically analyze the first is to argue for the development of an alternative world that is governed by the principles of Ma'at. This is my current work.
Sounds good. I much appreciate you sharing that with us, and we'll definitely revisit this because I think there's a lot of, not only I believe that there's a lot of power in us learning our own history and our own thoughts and our own principles to lead our community. So I'll leave that there, and I'll just like to extend the next couple of minutes if you have any last thoughts you want to share with us, and also tell us about where we can find your work.
I want to say this from the nervous center of my being. To reiterate a point that I made earlier. You honored me by inviting me to reach my people for the first time. Yes, I've appeared in SI, but that's not the kind of interview that I wanted to give. I'm a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
You gave me a forum to present myself as Ethiopia's philosopher. You couldn't have honored me more. You did it with a pure soul. You saw work, you read it. You did not respond to the name. You responded to the work with all its flaws, but a work that germinated in an Ethiopian soil, which might one day produce an Ethiopian canon. That's the dream. That is the plan. And I want to say thank you to you.
Thank you for
make this news media my second home, because I'm already a television producer. So that I can come and share my research and engage my people the way you engaged me. I'm most grateful.
Absolutely. Thank you again for accepting our invitation. And lots of people are watching this and they're all grateful. Really, if I could just reiterate everybody's thankfulness. And some of you have been asking what the book is and where you can find it. We're sharing it right now. It's called Ze'er Yacob. And if you just type in professor's name, Tedros Kiros, on Amazon, there's a wide range of books you could find of his, and this is definitely one of them as well. So thank you everyone for joining this conversation with us. And we just like to remind here on Adebabay Media, our goal is to bring to light a wide range of subjects and foster learning and inspire each other and provoke conversation that really matter. And today I hope you've learned something new. I definitely have learned quite a lot and have been inspired to learn more about Ethiopian philosophical thoughts and also continue this conversation among your peers. So we'd like to say again, please go ahead and share and like this conversation and subscribe if you haven't already. And until next week, Adebabay Media would like to wish you a fruitful week and good evening.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabay.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ